For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we are a membership organization devoted to promoting the use of native plants to create sustainable landscapes. We carry out our mission through educational programs and provide resources such as the Wild Ones Journal, native garden designs, Seeds for Education grants, and other educational webinars. At the local level, Wild Ones chapters deliver area programs, including garden tours, speakers, conferences, and seed exchanges. If you are not a Wild Ones member, we hope you join us and take advantage of the camaraderie and support that come with being a part of a local chapter. Our critical mission needs you. Wild Ones chapters are where members put mission into action. We get our hands dirty and learn by doing. Chapters are actively recruiting officers and volunteers to plan upcoming events. Chapter activities require the time and talents of many different people to coordinate. Amplify the impact you have on the native plant movement by sharing your skills and enthusiasm with others. Please reach out to your local chapter to find out how you can get involved. If there isn't a chapter near you, now's the time to consider starting a Wild One seedling chapter. Chapter founders across the country connect and collaborate with one another for mutual support and guidance. If you are eager to advance the mission and cultivate support for native plants in your area, visit the Start a Chapter page on the Wild Ones website. Wild Ones inspires people and communities across the country to transform home landscapes into vibrant and essential habitats for all forms of life. Programs like this would not be possible without generous support from our members, donors, and folks like you attending Wild Ones programs. Please consider donating to Wild Ones today by visiting donate.wildones.org.
Thank you for joining us for the Wild Ones Native Garden Design Series. My name is Michele Hensey, and I'll be your host for this discussion today. I have been a Wild Ones member since 2021 and will be stepping into the role of Vice President on the Wild Ones Board of Directors in 2023. I am honored to be talking with Julie Snell, partner at 10 Landscape Architects, who designed the Wild Ones Princeton native garden design for a large lot single-family home. Wild Ones native garden designs follow the premise that native plant landscaping can be beautiful, beneficial, and achievable for gardeners of all skill sets in terms of scope and budget. This program contains resources that include information on how to get started by identifying your ecoregion, selecting and determining plant placement in your yard, and considering your own specific climate conditions while finding local native plant nurseries in your area. The design we are sharing today joins a growing number of free downloadable native garden designs created by professional landscape designers representing various ecoregions in the United States. A plant list accompanies each design, highlighting the diversity and beauty of the native plants incorporated in the design. Also included are designer notes, which outline a phased approach to installation. All these materials can be downloaded and printed easily at home. All designs focus on the use of native plants that provide habitat and food for wildlife while adding color and beauty to your garden throughout the seasons. We hope these resources inspire, encourage, and motivate you on your native garden journey. We are honored today to have designer Julie Snell here with us. Julie is a founding partner of 10 Landscape Architects and co-owner-operator of Redbud Native Plant Nursery in Media, PA, just outside of Philadelphia. Julie has a background in fine arts, a master's degree in landscape architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and is a certified arborist. For more than 20 years, Julie has worked in both the public and private realms, focusing on the bridge between design and landscape management. As founder and co-chair of the Landscape Management Forum, she has forged a partnership with landscape managers throughout the Philadelphia region. Julie has been an adjunct instructor at Temple University in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Horticulture. She is currently serving on the board of trustees for the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, Michelle. It's nice to see you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I also wanted to mention the designs that we're going to talk about today. The folks in our office at 10, we all worked on together. And I just wanted to mention my partner, Lisa McDonald Haynes, who also presented a multifamily parcel. And so we worked on these two designs, and it was a team. So Angelica Diaz in our firm, and also Gretchen Trefny. So I just shout out to all of them. It's a group effort.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, let's talk about this design. Based in Princeton, New Jersey, this was a design for a very large family plot. And for those who are less familiar with the Princeton area, could you share with us, Julie, a bit about the typical weather and climate conditions, including the seasons, temperatures, and weather patterns that folks in Princeton are likely to experience?
Sure, yeah. So Princeton's not far from Philadelphia. It's located in central New Jersey. It's about halfway between Philadelphia and New York. Its hardiness zone is 6B. So it can get to a little bit below zero. It's possible, but usually the winter temps are, in the 20s and the 30s, that sort of thing. The last frost date is still on the books at May 15th, but usually that doesn't happen, but you have to watch out for that. Shoulder seasons are moderate. It seems like spring has becoming shorter and shorter, and we have a couple days of it and jump right into summer, but that's just been, I think, the last few years. Summers are usually high in the 80s, and it can get quite humid in this area. Fall is usually lovely, right? So it's a long season with mild temps, and that lasts all the way sometimes into December, which is a little weird, but first frost is around October, but the ground is not frozen until much later, so if at all. And rainfall is I'd say about 45 inches annually.
Okay, thank you. And for those new to gardening in the Princeton area, how would you describe what it's like to garden with native plants in that ecoregion, and what factors are a priority for a garden to thrive?
Sure. Well, this is New Jersey, the garden state after all. So plants want to grow here. Plants do well in New Jersey. But Princeton's located in that ecoregion level 3. It's called the Northern Piedmont, and it's really the Piedmont Plateau. It's very close to where the Piedmont and the coastal plain area are kind of close together. The topography in the Princeton area, I would say, is gently rolling hills, that sort of thing. And the soil there is typically clay soil. So less so sandy and more so clay. Tends to be on the acidic side. And there's lots of benefits to having that clay soil. It's mineral soil. It has a bank of nutrients, right? So it has things like magnesium and calcium and potassium, all things that plants need to grow. And it's very resilient. Clay soil can be very resilient during dry spells because it holds that moisture. But on the flip side, gardening in New Jersey, can have its challenges with this clay soil because clay soil is very easily compacted. So the soil structure can be damaged pretty easily. And clay soil also tends to have a slow infiltration rate or a low infiltration rate and slow drainage. And so that in some cases can be an issue. And if it does dry out, if we have extended periods of dry weather, sometimes that clay soil can be like a rock. So it's hard to sort of rehydrate. I think another thing to consider in this area, because we can get those humid humid summer days, powdery mildew can sometimes be a challenge. And so it's really important when you're gardening in New Jersey, if you're thinking about siting your plants, what the microclimate is, understanding the mature size of the plant is important, and making sure there's that good airflow. One last thing I would say is watering. So when we're watering during establishment, watering is definitely key. And so I would say that I always tell people, for instance, in the nursery, we're watering the root zone, we're watering the soil, we're not watering the plant. and that will help minimize the powdery mildew thing. So yeah, soil I think is a big one for New Jersey, understanding that.
Excellent. So moving on to more of the climate focus, most of the US has experienced some degree of climate change in the last decade or two. What climate condition changes have you observed over this time in the Princeton area?
Definitely, I would say increased precipitation, snow, less snow, more rain, and it's happening more quickly, right? So like pretty much any suburban area, there's lots of development pressure here. So we have more and more roads, more and more parking lots, more buildings, all around less pervious surface, right? So less chance of infiltration. So managing that stormwater is, I think, one of the biggest issues. And actually, most of our, I would say almost all of our residential projects, when they come to us, there's always a stormwater issue to be solved. There's always that question. So yeah, that's something. Princeton is located in the Raritan River watershed, and it has a high water table. There's about 50 miles of streams in this area. So the flood zones, there's a network of flood zones. So when we're seeing these storms that happen more quickly and increase volume because of all the paved surfaces, right? So that combined with the high water table and the clay soil, you can have these flash flood conditions in this area. And that's why our landscapes, right? Our landscapes, our soils, and our plants, they're so important because they have the ability to intercept that water, slow it down, and allow for that infiltration. Also, I think another change that I've noticed in our area, we're experiencing, more days with higher temperatures and less occurrence of low temperatures. And so it's kind of impacting what can grow here. So if you look at the native range of some of the more southern plants, for instance, southern magnolia, right? Magnolia grandiflora, that used to be something that couldn't really grow in this area. It wouldn't be cold hardy enough. Now I'm talking like maybe, decades back, like maybe 40 years. But now that is a reliable broadleaf evergreen that we use in our gardens. So there is this change happening, and it's important, it's an important area of research, looking at what southern species can grow in a more northern region. And so that's becoming sort of an important thing that we kind of look to, and we kind of seek out that research to know what to tell our clients and what to provide in the nursery.
Thank you. That's a great example with the magnolia moving more into this zone and ability to thrive here. Are there other aspects of the design and qualities of the native plants chosen that help to mitigate the effects of these climate changes we've seen?
Yeah, so we prepared 2 templates for Wild One for this native garden series, and one focused on a smaller multifamily lot. And this one that we're looking at right now is on this typical 1 acre parcel. And we did that because each represents a typical form of housing form in our region. So we wanted to use both to be able to present as many issues that we typically see in our work. And so, for example, with the template for the large urban lot, we were able to address a few things that we feel could demonstrate this mitigation, right? So for the urban lot, we are addressing a remnant woodland, invasive plant pressure, a degraded stream, deer pressure, and occasional flooding. So we were able to look at those things. And I would say probably one of the most direct ways to talk about mitigating effects of climate change would be to look at stormwater management on the site. So particularly looking at ways to improve the health and function of the stream, of the pond and the stream that run through the property. So the existing conditions of the stream, I'll just mention the existing conditions, the grass right up to the edge and it was being mowed. I mentioned that flash flooding. So water moving quickly through the sites, scoured the edges and caused erosion. So a mitigation strategy is to create a riparian buffer along both sides of that stream. And so by doing that, we reestablish those stream banks, we root in, more woody plants, and we allow that flood, we kind of rebuild the floodplain. We allow that flooding to happen. And in this way, we're helping mitigate those effects.
Thank you. Talking about the design itself, can you share your approach to developing a design and some of the features that you included and why they were included?
Sure. Yeah. So audience, viewers, if you haven't done so already, this would be a good time to, to reference the design package that comes with this series. So there's a packet of information there. So we have existing conditions plan, site analysis plan that describes the site features. So you know, like where we started, where the baseline was. And it really demonstrates the opportunities and the constraints of the site. You see on the screen right now, sort of the finished design, the layout plan. And then we also have the planting plans. And the planting plan there's lots of, there's several documents in the planting plan. So you're able to go into these different areas. You're able to look at the terrace and the patio and the woodland and the stream bank and really see the detail of the planting plan there. And so that's really helpful. We also have a plant schedule that kind of tells you things, not only the plant list, but it will tell you bloom time and fall color and things like that. So our approach, we always start with site analysis. That's how we approach every project. And we have a sort of checklist that we go through with our clients. And that's to understand their goals and their desires and the intended use of the space. And often we use precedent images. We show them examples. And that's a way to sort of draw out what their style is and what their preferences are. And that's a really helpful exercise. But our approach, is always to increase the function and the health of the landscape. So even though, we're creating a beautiful garden, we are really focused on the health and the function of the landscape, because, we can't afford for our landscapes to be only curb appeal, right? Like it's just, we can't do that anymore. We need our landscapes to work, like literally work. They manage stormwater, they provide habitat for insects and wildlife. They provide habitat for us, right? We're part of nature. We need to be in the picture. They moderate temperatures, they filter air, but they do provide beauty. So I don't want to minimize that, because it's not just curb appeal, and beauty is actually one of the most important factors, but it's not that surface beauty. It stands for something. After all, our clients are hiring us. They want a beautiful garden, right? So that's a really important thing. But in thinking about beauty, I think that it's that beauty. Beauty's the hook. It's what grabs us, and what makes us pay attention. It gives pause. It sort of allows that interaction between you and the garden, you and the plants. So it's really important. And I think, our job in many ways is to create those ways that we can allow ourselves to be in the garden, to be in the landscape. So for this design, we've created, views basically, from the house, from inside the house. We're creating a visual connection at certain points from inside the house out into the landscape, from the landscape, as framing the view of the house. So that's a really important back and forth. And we've created destinations within the landscape to allow you to access different points. Like, for instance, we really worked on that woodland edge to create a transition between the lawn area and the woods, and to give you so to create that idea of something's there, right? So you see something, it piques your interest, you want to go in. And so there's a woodland walk, say, and in the meadow area closer to the stream, there's different pathways there that can be mown in different directions. And that sort of allows you access into the meadow and then up to the stream bank. So it's sort of allowing access to those different places.
That was a beautiful description. I could imagine myself walking on the property as you were designing or explaining the design approach there. It's also nice to be reminded that above and beyond the beauty, all the services that the native gardens provide, we humans and all other living beings.
Yeah.
Can you share a bit more? It's just a beautiful design, Julie, about how the garden will change in the different seasons?
Sure. Yes. I'm going to go to my packet here and show you an example of the plant schedule. So there's several pages. I don't know if you can see that, but it's the pages, you know, that have,
Yes.
it's the Excel spreadsheet with all these colors on the end. So those are important, these plant schedules. And we're able to say what the plants are doing at each season. And so it's a bloom calendar for sure, and it tells you the fall color, but there's also indications on that plant schedule. Does it have seed heads? Does it have interesting bark? Is there a textural element? Are there berries? So that's a helpful tool that we use in our work to communicate that with our clients, to let them know how their garden will change from season to season, right? So we want to draw you out into the garden all year long, right? And not just that, you know, especially on that warm day in January. And there's this term that I heard recently at an ELA conference called winterest. I don't know if Lisa mentioned this as well, but this is a wonderful word. It's a mashup of winter and interest, right? Winterest. And a shout out to Mallory and Claire from Refugia Design who coined this. Well, maybe, I don't know if they did or not, but I heard it from them. And it's a wonderful term, and I'm going to keep using it. So it's important to think about the full year and all the seasons. And that winterest idea, I just loved. But in order to have that interest in the winter, we actually have to think about our maintenance practices, right? So this brings up sort of an adjustment to our conventional maintenance practices, right? So we know that many of our insects and wildlife, they use our gardens over the winter, right? And some need actual, you know, specific habitats to complete their life cycle. So we can help support that by shifting our garden maintenance practices as well. So especially the idea of this of fall cleanup, right? So that conventional fall cleanup of moving everything out of the garden. So at Tend and at Redbud, we don't recommend taking that scorched earth approach to fall cleanup. You know, we recommend two things. First, you want to change the timing. So instead of doing that garden cleanup in the fall, push off those operations to late winter, early spring. And second, do it differently, right? So think about ways you can support the life cycle of insects and small animals. For instance, if you leave stalks of ornamental grasses or perennials, like you leave those up standing, and that helps provide habitat for overwintering bees and other insects. And then when you do cut them down later, you're cutting them at a higher, you're leaving them a little taller to continue to provide that habitat through the season. You could also think about your leaves. You know, as your leaves drop from your trees, that's an amazing resource, right? So are there areas in your garden where you can leave the leaves, right? Can they accumulate under a tree and allow for overwintering to happen in that area? If your leaves fall on the grass, on the turf, maybe you're mowing those and shredding those right over the grass and allowing those nutrients back into the soil. If it's too many leaves, if you need to remove them, you have an amazing resource. You know, definitely use those leaves, collect them, stack them up, you know, use chicken wire or something, just make sort of bins and put those leaves in there. And by the time the next spring comes around, the next summer, you have this great leaf mulch that you can use back in your gardens. So coming at thinking about seasonal interest and how your maintenance practices can support the design, we're always thinking of those things as well.
That's wonderful. I think you touched on this. My next question was going to be how the design does support and preserve plant and wildlife species. You touched on that a bit with us not cleaning up and, leaving the leaf litter longer. Are there other pointers that you can give to us, Julie, about how those specific plants help the native ecosystem?
Sure. We talked about the leaves, and we talked about sort of leaving the remnants of the plants in place to allow for those life cycles. When we talk about, like, for instance, this design, we have that remnant woodland at the top of the page there. That's all woodland area. And when we, as you can see, when you look at the existing conditions and you read the report, the notes, that remnant woodland is adjacent to a natural area. And so we have all this pressure from invasive plants coming in from that natural area. And then also the understory, we also have deer coming in from that natural area. And so the understory of that woodland has been decimated by deer. And so that was one of the challenges with this site. And we do see this often. This is a kind of a typical thing where we have pressure from invasive weeds and we have deer that have kind of caused a problem. So how can we help to preserve the keystone and the native trees that are there? And how can we then help to reestablish? So we work to, clear out what we can and help to reestablish those layers of understory and ground layer to make that a working ecosystem again. And that helps to restore habitat. It brings biodiversity, right? And then, I'll also mention about the stream that goes through the property. We talked a little bit about reestablishing the stream banks, bringing in herbaceous and woodies, but also that understory layer, the understory and the overstory layer, the canopy trees. Those are really crucial to the health of the stream and the life in that area, because right now, as it was when we came upon it, it was totally open. It was all sunny and degraded. And there's no life in that stream if the water is heated up to a temperature, to a high temperature. And so by providing shade, you're actually changing the ecology in the stream. You're allowing for, the fish species and the microbiology to come back in the stream as well. So thinking of things like that is a good way to, you have to think through the whole cycle.
Yeah. Well, that's so interesting. I had no idea about shading a stream and how important that would be. Thank you. Julie, the plants selected for this design are native to the Mid-Atlantic Princeton region, and Wild Ones currently has 3 chapters in New Jersey. The New Jersey Gateway chapter is based in densely populated Hudson County. The New Jersey Skylands Seedling chapter covers Mercer and northern counties, and the Southern New Jersey Seedling chapter covers some of the coastal and southern counties. Can you share how elements of this design might be adapted to other parts of the state?
Sure. I think there are many things from this design and also from the multifamily design that we did as well that's on a smaller footprint that can be adapted to other sites. I think the key thing, though, is to understand your site. You always start from there, right? You start from the existing site conditions. And so things like understanding where you are in the watershed, understanding your soil. These are sort of key factors that you should know before then you look to ways that you can pull from these different ideas. But once you know those, you kind of have those things kind of in your back pocket, then you could say, okay, I'm going to look for those similar conditions and start to use those things. And we have links to those resources in our designer notes. So you can figure out your watershed, for instance. You can figure out where to, how to take a soil sample and where to send it for testing. But those are definitely 2 key things. And I would start from that place and then figure out what would be appropriate.
Okay, let's touch on site analysis a bit. What are some of the things that you recommend be considered prior to planting?
Sure. So it continues from your last question. I think, the most important thing is to understand your site. Site analysis is that critical piece, and that's that starting point. So it's important to observe the basics. Where are the sunshade patterns on your site, right? What type of soil is it? What sort of drainage, what's happening with the water on your site? But also views are important. Where do you want there to be a view? Is there a view existing? What is the view of? What are the adjacencies, right? How about the circulation on the site? Consider, do you have any right now? How do you get from A to B, the driveway to the backyard, to the back door, that sort of thing? These simple things, once you start to map them out, you can start to see if things are working or not working. Maybe you want to create a view in that area. Maybe you need to connect the dots a little bit. So those are important. But also before you begin, so like understanding your site and those basic site analysis questions, I think that's important to do before you begin. But I think another thing to think about is just to think about your capacity, right? So before you take on a project, you want to think about what you can do yourself, and then maybe you map out where are the areas where I'll need help. Who is going to be implementing it? Are you hiring someone to do it? Is this a big job? Is it a small job? Are you looking for a gardener? Are you looking for a landscape contractor? And then who will maintain it, right? So that's always the key. Who's going to water it? Who's going to weed it? These are important factors that are important to think about from the beginning, from the standpoint. And then I would also say basic tools, right? So if you're out there in the garden, I always recommend a good pair of bypass pruners, a good pair of pruners, a good shovel that fits you. I'm not too tall, so I need kind of a shorter shovel, and that's going to be really easy to use. A weeding knife, that's an excellent tool that I use for pretty much everything. So those are the three things that I think I would say you should have in your toolbox.
Okay. And you've mentioned the soil in this location being, I believe, more leaning to the clay. And given the soil type that you identified, do you recommend any amendments or preparation for the soil prior to planting?
Right. So we are dealing in this site, at this site, mostly clay soil, but you may be dealing with, it may be clay, but a lot of times it's disturbance, right? So a lot of times the sites that we deal with are not necessarily the native soils. There's a lot of disturbance, and so there's a lot of urban fill. And I think urban fill should be on that soil triangle. Like it happens so much, it's almost more so than the native soil sometimes. But I just say that because it's important to match your choices going forward with the site condition, right? So you want to work with what you have and kind of move from there. For instance, it's kind of difficult if your pH is very high or very low. It's hard to change pH, and it's not a real sustainable thing to do across a large area. So you kind of have to figure out, okay, I have high pH. What are the plants that are going to work in that condition? Or what are the small practices that I can do to amend it in certain areas? But for clay soil, thinking about clay, I'd say that probably the thing that happens most is compaction, because it's so easily compacted. And so lessening the compaction of clay soil is the trick, I think, in most cases. And we recommend using things, if it's on a small scale, you can use hand tools, right? So if you're in your garden, you could use a garden fork, or there's something called a broad fork, which is sort of a wider, bigger garden fork that you actually stand on and you kind of rock back and forth, and you're able to create these fissures. A garden fork and a broad fork really do the same thing. They create these fissures in the soil. So you're not tilling the soil, but you're creating these cracks that go down a few inches. And so by doing that, you're allowing air and water into a deeper layer of the clay soil. And in that way, you're breaking up the compaction. And then by adding in organic material, clay soil is mostly a mineral soil. So if you add in organic matter, that's going to help make the soil a little more friable, lighter, and help to start to build those aggregates in the structure of the soil back. Caution you on knowing your soil, though, like your soil test is going to tell you what your percentage organic matter percentage is. And so that's important to know when you're adding in organic, because there is such thing as, too much of a good thing. So you want to know what you need to know to make those changes.
Thank you. And Julie, for those who may not know, when you mention adding organic matter, is that more the compost?
It can be compost. It can be those wonderful leaves that you have collected and made into leaf mulch. That's a great thing to add into your soil. I know some people that use wood chips, and I think wood chips are fine. You just sort of have to be careful of the source. You don't want, for instance, wood chips that came from pallets or, were treated in any way. So you want to call an arborist and say, when you have a good clean load of chips, I'd love that because I can use that for my garden. Yeah. I think I did mention about, avoiding tilling. And the reason why I say that is because you want to preserve the soil structure at all costs. So if you till, you're sort of, you're destroying soil structure. So if you could avoid that, if possible, and do that fracturing, and it's a different operation.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In your designer notes, you describe a simple method for evaluating drainage on a site. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. There are a couple of observations I think you can do, easy observations to learn about your soil. So one is that drainage, and another one, and I'll talk about that, and another one is a ribbon test. So both involve digging a hole, getting your hands dirty. You dig a hole, you get a handful of soil. This is the ribbon test to find out the texture of your soil. And so you get a handful of soil, you make a ball, and then you start to work out sort of a ribbon between your thumb and forefinger and your pointer finger. And if you can kind of make a ribbon, if that soil stays together for an inch or so, you probably have clay soil. If you can't make a ribbon, if it's breaking, that's a clue that you have more sand in your soil. So that's a nice tactile way to get to know your soil. And then the other thing you could do if you're thinking about, you want to know the drainage. So you dig a hole. It doesn't have to be too big, maybe 12 inches wide or so. And then you fill that hole with water, let it drain out. Then you fill it again with a known quantity of water, say a couple gallons or something. And then you observe, you time how long it takes for that water to disappear. So then you would know, okay, I had 5 gallons and it was gone in 4 hours. So between 4 and 6 hours is kind of a slow a drainage. If it goes away within an hour or so, that's really good drainage. And certainly if it's there the next day, you got some hard pan or some compaction layer going on there for sure.
Interesting. I can't wait to try both of those, actually. So
I love anything that you can get your hands dirty.
Yeah, especially with the ribbon. I hadn't heard of that before. Can you tell us more about challenges gardeners face in suburban New Jersey?
Sure. I bet everyone is saying it right now. Deer, right?
Yes.
That is the number one thing that we hear in the nursery. That's the biggest question. It's a challenge. It's a reality that gardeners are dealing with for sure. Because development is happening and the habitats are getting smaller and smaller. So that's a thing. So nothing is deer proof. Except for maybe a really tall fence, which is really expensive to do, and the undertaking. So deer pressure is different depending on certain factors, right? The time of year, the population, where your garden is located in relation to where those deer are coming out of the woods or something. If you're the first one if they come out of the woods right next door to you, your place is going to get hit more so than maybe your neighbors. But the good thing is knowing that deers are creatures of habit. So there's things we can do to hopefully change their habit or block their path a little bit that may have an impact, that may help. And so by maybe not a whole deer fence, but maybe you're blocking off an access point to your garden, and in that way maybe the deer are then going to like take another route around. Also for this design, we've of course chosen deer resistant plants, meaning they bounce back basically. Either there's a strong fragrance. Deer typically don't like things with a fragrance, and so either it has a fragrance, or maybe it doesn't mind being munched a little bit and it's not going to impact the health of the plant. So that sort of thing. But sometimes you can use plants with fragrance to kind of create a barrier as well. So maybe you have a more sensitive plant, but you use something like mountain mint around it to sort of keep the deer away. And I've heard people, I know gardeners that use that strategy, and it's pretty effective. So speaking of strategy, planting strategy, you might want to think, I've seen this a lot. I've seen, pruned by deer browse. You've seen that line of arborvitae, and they have this very interesting pruning technique. They're really skinny at the base, and then it gets to about 4 feet and it starts to fan out again and it goes back up. So that's the effect of deer browse, right? So deer kind of start out with their mouth on their head down close to the ground, and then they go up about 4 feet or so, and that's the zone that they're going to browse pretty regularly, and we can see that in the arborvitae. So instead of that, everybody loves a buffer, right? Everybody loves their neighbors, but nobody wants to see them, and so everybody wants a hedgerow buffer. And so you see lots of lines of arborvitae. But what if we did something different? What if we kind of did a hedgerow instead of that line of evergreens, those soldiers in a row? So in that way, we could then mix in other things, deciduous plants that would give us interest in different times of year. And maybe some of those things are more deer resistant. Sure, you can use an evergreen or so and work it in, but think of it in a more complex planting. And so, even if that deer does browse a little bit, it's not gonna be the only thing you see in that buffer. So thinking of strategy in your planting design when you have deer is a good thing.
Excellent. That's a great idea to deter them as much as possible. It's a huge problem in the area. So let's move on to woodland restoration and invasive plant management. I know that is another challenge many gardeners in the area have. Your designer notes touched on some priorities that you suggest be addressed. Can you focus first on woodland restoration and invasive plant management, and tell us why you recommend starting there?
Sure. Well, at this site, there were these, competing interests, and I think it was a little difficult to choose. But when addressing when addressing this, right, you kind of have to look at what is the most hazardous condition and try to approach that first, right? So dead, damaged trees, the flooding, the erosion of the stream bank, the invasive plant encroachment. These are all these competing but equally important issues that we had to address. And so like once you kind of stabilize or sort of have those things considered, then you can move on to stabilization, such as replanting. And lastly, like once those things are kind of addressed, then we thought through of like moving to the amenity spaces. So because the deer pressure and the invasives coming in, we thought that was sort of the highest priority thing. So we decided to start there. But I'll just mention that, this is all a process, and it takes time to do it. And so sometimes you have to think about what you can take on and how much you can do. So even though we were starting in that woodland, maybe we weren't doing the whole woodland at once. It was the edge closest to the lawn that would be stabilized first, and then we would kind of move in further. So even within that, you have to really think strategically about how you're going to approach this work. I think we're going to get into a little bit more of that, maybe with the next question.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to understand more about why the removal should be followed by that replanting and restoration and the exclusionary wire fencing if needed. Why did the two, is it so important to get those two done pretty much together?
Yeah. So if you take something out, right, and you leave it empty, because of that pressure from the invasive weeds, there's a seed bank there. There's active growth coming in from the adjacent property. It's going to get filled, and it's going to get filled with things that you don't want there. So when you're doing your removal, you have to think, what am I going to put back in? And it's going to hold that space, and how it's going to hold that space. So you're always thinking about your management strategies and your replacement strategies kind of together. It's a hand-in-hand thing. And then, when you're dealing with invasive plants or any weeds, really, you have to know the plant. It's really going to make it easier on you if you understand the habit, right? You understand the life cycle. Like, for instance, is this a winter annual that sets seed? Is it a woody climbing vine? Is it a perennial that spreads by underground runners? All of these things, like understanding when it flowers, when it sets seeds, all of these are clues to figuring out the best management strategy. And it is a management strategy, I think, versus a removal strategy, because in many cases, things are just, they're out there. There's no way we're going to be eliminating things, right? Because of the pressure coming in from all the edges, or the birds flying through, or whatever, it's the seed bank is there. Things are going to happen. So it's probably better to think of things as a management strategy versus a removal. I mean, I'm not saying that it isn't possible to, on a small scale and very specific, discrete projects, to do a removal, but most of us are dealing, not in those sort of very discrete areas. Most of us are in this continuum and are dealing with, other things. And so thinking of it as a management, and knowing that monitoring and ongoing action are part of the process is really helpful. You asked about fencing, and we definitely recommend, deer fencing for certain species. For instance, oaks, right? It's so important to get oaks back in our landscape. And in this woodland, we certainly want to plant oaks. But those are one of the favorites for the deers to come and munch and, rub up against. And so putting a deer fence around a young oak until it's large enough and sturdy enough to stand on its own, that's going to be really, really important. We work also with a local native land trust, and they make islands, which I think is a great idea. So in a more naturalized area where you can kind of plant it in an island, and then you're putting your fencing sort of around that island. And so instead of putting the fence at the edge of your property, think of it as small little islands that maybe you could fence more easily, and then allow those, the canopy, the understory, the ground layer to happen within that island space. And then if you have several of these islands, then it's kind of cool that you could reestablish an area that way. But I understand, this all can be kind of overwhelming, especially when you're dealing with invasive plants and deer pressure. Like, those are probably the two hardest things, right? So try not to get overwhelmed by that. And a lot of times we recommend that you could work with a professional. You could work with a landscape contractor who does, land management and removal of invasive plants. And they're really helpful. Like, if working with them sometimes can look like they're there once a season at these critical moments where things, before they go to seed, for instance, or while something is still small, they can catch it. And so that can be really helpful, and that can be sort of another tool in your toolbox. And then that way it doesn't feel too overwhelming. Maybe it's not all on you.
Thank you. It is overwhelming. to tackle invasive plants. So all your suggestions and looking at it as a management plan, I think helps greatly. It is overwhelming. So Julie, assuming that's all been done and we're ready to plant, which understory trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants do you recommend for the woodland restoration?
Yeah, so the woodland, there's the edge of the woodland is really the critical piece from the point of view of the homeowner, right? And from the view from the house and from the patio and the backyard, what is the edge of that woodland? What's the experience there? And before, because there was a lack of understory, it went from open lawn to remnant canopy trees, and there was no transition whatsoever. But in a natural situation, like there's that forest edge. So we wanted to recreate that forest edge and allow you into the space, have that transition between the open, sunny lawn area and then slowly into the shady woodland. And so we were looking at really reintroducing that understory, that edge of woods. So the Cyananthus, the fringe tree, our favorite Cornus florida, our native dogwoods. But then large scale shrubs really can help to build that backbone as well. So Aeschylus, bottlebrush buckeye, some Itea virginica, that's another one that holds the space really well. It's a suckering shrub and it's going to fill up. So those are some of the shrubs that we looked at. And then thinking about that ground layer transition, we looked at perennials and we use grasses in that area too. Things like Amsonia, Monarda fistulosa, Panicum virgatum. Those are all used in that area to help establish that transition zone.
That sounds beautiful. Okay, you also provide a list of deer-resistant, low-growing herbaceous and ornamental grass species to add to the stream edge. Can you talk a bit about the benefits of adding these to the landscape and which ones you specifically recommend?
Sure. So we've mentioned the stream a few times, right? And those edges, the stream bank edges were very degraded due to erosion. So if you can picture, the water moving really fast is scouring the edge of the stream. So you have a very abrupt edge. And so what we want to do is we want to do some grading there. We want to cut down the stream banks to reestablish that nice gradual floodplain from the meadow area down to the stream. And so we did that, and then we replanted with riparian species. And the plants, they help to root in that new edge, right? So our perennials and our grasses and our woody shrubs are doing that. They're holding the stream. Not only do they hold the stream, but where there was nothing, right? It was just like an abrupt edge. Now we've actually created a habitat zone of ground layer, herbaceous and woody things. So we've created this new area of habitat with the stream as well. And so plants that we use in that area, Asclepias incarnata, the rose milkweed, and Carex, Bilpinoides, a bunch of different irises in that area. Juncus effusus was a good one. Vernonia, Lettermanii, that's another favorite. Joe Pye, things like that in that zone, and just beautiful blooms. It's going to give you a lot of pleasure too, visual interest during the season, and a lot of pollinator action for sure.
Thank you. You also mentioned a planting method called live staking to help with the stream bank restoration. Can you share more about that process and how it helps?
Sure. Yeah, live staking, basically it's cuttings from woody shrubs and things that root really easily, like dogwood and willow. We also use Sambucus, elderberry in this area. And so along with those things that I was just mentioning, you want to hold the stream edge, the new banks. This live staking method is a really great way to do it. It's a bit of a timing issue. They're available at certain times of year, usually in the early spring. You can, if you have this material on site, you could make your own stakes and do it, do your cuttings and just basically stick them into the ground. And they root in and they hold the bank there. So it's really a great way to directly have that woody vegetation where you need it. Very affordable.
Excellent. You also mentioned shifting our thinking from planting in the spring to planting in the fall. And we touched on this a bit with Lisa, but can you reiterate for folks watching this design about the benefits of planting in the fall for native plants?
Sure. So we're asking you to shift your thinking on a couple of things, right? We want to shift your maintenance practices and do that cleanup late winter, early spring. And we also want you to shift your idea of the best time to plant. So fall is really the best planting season. It really is our preference. If you think about it, spring is pretty busy. Now you have all that cleanup stuff to do in the spring, but also when you plant in the spring, you have to be really super vigilant about watering in the summer, right? So you have these new plants that you just put in. And so watering during the hot summer, and if you get a drought or something, that's going to be really stressful for those young plants, not to mention you, having to drag that hose around and make sure it's all watered. But when you shift your planting to the fall, right? August, September, October, even into November. Actually, you can plant in December if the ground's not frozen, depending on what it is. Woody plants, totally happy. But the idea there is plants get in the ground, and before the ground freezes, they have a long season to sort of get settled in, and their roots, they get tucked in there. And by the time, when it starts to heat up in the spring, they're actively growing. They're like that much more ahead. And then by the time the heat of the next summer comes, they're going to be a little more resilient to it. It doesn't mean you don't have to water. You still have to water. It's just you're not, it's not as stressful a situation for those plants. And it really makes a difference. Mm-hmm.
That's very helpful. And I want to move on to, again, the design itself and more around the house and the patio. You talked earlier about creating spaces that provide more beauty and pleasure to residents. And can you share specifically which things you included or considered in the design to achieve that vision?
Sure. So framing views was key for this design, right? In making sure there was that visual connection inside the house, looking out, and in that way it draws you out into the landscape, and really making, when you're in the landscape, creating those destinations. So things like the woodland walk, creating access into the woods, right? We've spent all that time talking about that transition of the woodland edge. And so creating a walk in that area allows you to be up close and personal and be in that space. And so we thought that was a really important thing, both visually and physically, spatially. The pond edge and the meadow edge, I think, these are picturesque things that allow for a nice view. But the way that we've created these spaces, these sort of ways to inhabit the landscape, the fire pit and the play area, you get closer to these areas and you're able to actually be within them. The meadow, thinking about, how you can change the pathways by just different mowing practices. Maybe you're going to have a meandering path one year, but the next year you're going to go, straight from here to there. You can change these different experiences. And so these were the things that we were kind of thinking about and wanting to do. But really, I think the great thing about these designs, and I mean the whole series of what the Wild Ones is highlighting with these native plant gardens, it shows what we can do with our landscapes, right? No matter what the size, we can make places where we can spend time outside. And that builds connections. It builds connections to like seeing and smelling and touching those plants, like we're in that relationship then. So I think what these designs are doing, no matter if it's like a fire pit or it's a seasonal garden or it's a, you know, the cornhole court from the other garden, it's these places that allow you to be in the space.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You also mentioned a lawn removal strategy called solarization to prepare specifically for the patio gardens. Can you explain what that is, Julie, and what the timing would be for that and the benefits as well?
Sure. Solarization, it's a great low impact, non-chemical way to prepare a lawn area to be a garden. It requires UV plastic. So that means it's stable. It's not going to degrade in the sun. It's going to be out there for a while. So clear plastic sheeting. That the drawback is that can be expensive if you're buying UV sheeting, because it usually is pretty large. If you're buying that new, it can be quite expensive. Sometimes you can get that sheeting secondhand. You can get on those sort of listservs or something to if someone has a hoop house and they have to replace the plastic, sometimes you can use that plastic that was on the hoop house. You can utilize that in solarization. So solarization, it's use clear UV plastic, right? And you spread it over an area. It's a flat area. It needs to be a sunny location. This is good for an area that was maybe a lawn or maybe kind of low pressure weeds. And so it takes time. You usually install it in late winter, early spring. It stays there for the summer. And then usually by the fall, early fall, you're ready to plant that area. And how it works is, you know, the sun heats up the area below the plastic to a certain, the soil gets to such a temperature that it's going to kill the weed seeds in there. There's also this other thing that it does. It's called seedling flushing. Meaning, if you can think about in the early spring, the sun goes through the clear plastic and those seeds that would have germinated are still going to germinate, right? So you still have things, seedlings that kind of come up and emerge underneath the plastic, but they don't last that long, right? So they're going to die under there. Sometimes you see people using black plastic, and that doesn't work exactly the same way. For instance, the sunlight doesn't penetrate, so you don't get that seedling flushing. And then also the way that the convection works, I guess, the black plastic reflects some of the light, and so it doesn't get as hot under the black plastic, so it may not kill as many of the weed seeds as the clear does. The clear is not foolproof either. Like there are some, you have to know what's there, right? For instance, if you had a perennial weed that was a real, like for instance, nut sedge or something, that may not, you know, the solarization might not get that. So even though it's a great way to, in a low impact way, easy on your back, say, is if you have the time to wait, it's a good way to get rid of lawn, but you still may have to go in and sort of spot check and dig certain things like a thistle or a nut sedge kind of a thing. So did I tell you everything about solarization?
Yeah, that's so interesting that clear plastic. I would have thought the opposite. So that is so helpful to understand that using the clear is actually more beneficial.
So I'll just quickly add though, you know, that, so you need a sunny location, usually a flat location, you need the time, and the, you know, you need the plastic. But the faster way to do it would be to cut the sod, right? So if you want to go in there quickly, so the difference there is this is going to be more labor intensive, but it's going to be faster. So basically, if you have a lawn area and it's not too big, you can maybe do that by hand by cutting the sod out. So you're removing sort of the top few inches of soil and therefore removing the top few inches of possible seed bank that's in that soil. And you take that away, it gets composted, that sort of thing. But then, of course, you can't leave bare soil, so you have to plant that area right away. So that's the quick way. It's more labor intensive versus solarization, right?
Julie, if someone were to cut the sod and go with that approach of immediately replanting, because you're removing the first few inches, do you then recommend any amendments or just get replanted right away?
That's when I would rely on that leaf mulch. I would bring in a nice thick layer of that, and that's going to break down and sort of make that rebuild that top layer, that organic layer of soil. So I would do that. I would bring that in. Mm-hmm.
Great, good. Okay, and for those who may not have the resources to install this type of design all at once, how do you recommend a homeowner work in phases as resources and time allow?
Yeah. Phasing, we always think about this, and this is something that we're always putting to our clients, like, is this happening all at once? Are you thinking about phasing? Because that's important to know when you're sort of building a design approach, is what areas they're thinking about doing first, or the whole thing, or if they're doing it themselves, like maybe they'll do a little bit at a time. So phasing is based on your priorities, basically, right? And that's going to set how the project is accomplished. And so we ask the clients, we ask the homeowners that from the beginning, we talk about phasing. So if you're going to hire a contractor, for instance, maybe it is kind of quick, but even within a big project that you might be hiring a contractor for, there may be certain sections of it that you do first. So even in that case, there would be a phasing aspect. So if you're doing it yourself, I think what you need to think about is, what's going to drive that is time and level of effort. So usually if you want it to happen quick, usually the level of effort might be low, but the cost might be higher. So if you're doing it yourself and you can afford to take a little bit of time to do it, maybe the cost will be low, but the effort will be more. And so it's thinking through your project like that is to do it, right? So thinking strategically about the planting itself, I tend to ask people to think about what are the bones of the garden. So for instance, what I mean by that is, what's the structure that you're trying to create? And usually that's the biggest and longest lasting items, the trees, right? Or the shrubs. And so I tend to look at those as the important kind of placeholders of the garden, and maybe consider those, do those first, or at least consider those first, and make very strategic choices about how you're going to do that. And then when you think about, I think there's different ways to approach priorities and to approach the cost of a project. If you look at plant sizes, like the original size that you pick, the container size of plants, maybe for that one tree, you want it to look like something going in. So here at the nursery, we're looking at like a number 5 container. That's like a sweet spot, I think. A number 5, a number 7. So those containers, you can still lift it. Usually one person can still lift it. It can still fit in a car, but it's going to look like something going in. It's a tree that's going to be 4 to 6 feet tall. A small tree, but it still has a presence. So that's kind of a nice size if you want to kind of go on the bigger side, but still do it yourself. If you go any bigger than that, for instance, if you go with balled and burlap material, that you're pushing it to the contractor realm, right? Because you need equipment to move that. You need more than one person, usually 4, to move. It's hundreds of pounds versus, tens of pounds. So it's different. And also, if you start with a smaller tree, the studies show us that, a balled and burlap tree and a smaller tree, they get planted at the same time. It takes that bigger tree longer to establish its root system. And so therefore it takes longer for it to actively grow on top, versus that smaller tree. It's going to be a shorter amount of time for it to establish its roots, and it's going to start actively growing in its shoots faster than that other tree. So they could catch up, right? In a relatively similar time frame. So that's important. I think you can think about that. Mm-hmm. Shrubs, sorry, I'm going on here, but shrubs, typically it's like the number 3 container, like that's been the typical thing. And it's really a good size. It looks like something going in, but more and more, we're seeing things available in 2s and 1s. And at first I didn't think that was very practical, but and talking with the homeowners, sometimes they don't want to dig that big hole. Sometimes they just want, I'm going to get this number one and I know it's going to grow fast and I'm fine with that. Now it's going to take a little time to grow, but I'm fine with that. So maybe be choosy on the species that you're getting in a smaller container. Like, I'll jump to perennials real quick. I don't want to stay on this too long, but in perennials, like think of things that maybe take a long time to grow, like Baptisia, for instance. That takes about 3 years to establish. Maybe you want to start with a larger one. So maybe you're starting with a number 1 or a number 2 container, a gallon, to start, because you have to wait a while. But something like mountain mint, that grows real fast. So go ahead and get that quart, And so thinking through strategically like that is a good way to, figure out your phasing as well.
Those are great ideas. Okay, I personally have learned so much from you today. I have lots of notes. And before we start closing, is there anything else that you would like to share that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I think that, we have touched on it a little bit, building those connections to nature, when you plant a garden. When you're doing that, you're inviting engagement, right? So you're inviting engagement with insects, with butterflies, with birds, with bees. But also, if you're turning your front lawn into a beautiful garden, you're inviting engagement with your neighbors, right? So, consider your planting endeavors. This is an excuse to talk to your neighbors, right? It's an excuse to talk to your HOA. It's an excuse to talk to your friends. Let them all know what you're up to, what you're learning, right? And this is another way to connect. And it's a way to strengthen these social connections that are so important to us, right? So in the process, I feel like we might be able to tackle some of these like antiquated ideas. And for instance, right, that antiquated HOA rules around miles of mown lawn, for instance, like the folks that I recently read about, that we all read about in Maryland, Janet and Jeff Crouch, right? They challenged their HOA. They established this beautiful pollinator garden in their front lawn that, smacked up against their HOA rules. But that led to changing the state law in Maryland that says that, the HOAs can't limit they can't have control over eco-friendly lawns. So bravo to them. And so, you never know like what these gardens can do. I feel like it's building connections in the natural world and between people. And so.
That's a beautiful reminder to close with, Julie. Thank you.
You're welcome. This has been fun. Thank you, Michele.
It has been. Thanks so much for sharing your talent and expertise, and TENS as well, as I know your other designers helped build both of these designs, and sharing it with us today. Julie's single-family large parcel Princeton design, plant list, designer notes, and a list of regional native plant nurseries can be found online at nativegardendesigns.wildones.org. We ask that you help us to continually improve our webinars by taking a short survey after watching this program. And thank you again, Julie, for joining us. We hope those watching feel inspired and empowered to plant more native plants in their communities. Thank you and have a wonderful day.